Hey there, Hypatia. Thanks for joining me again for another episode.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
All right, so we're on parts three and four of Nicholas Berdyaev's Slavery and Freedom. And in these sections, he's going to be discussing the different ways in which slavery entraps us. Um, and in part three, he's going to be discussing, it's broken up into a few different sections. Section A through E, and he's going to be discussing the slavery of sovereignty. And the section heading is the twofold image of the state, the lure of war, the slavery of man to war, the lure of slavery of nationalism, nation and people. And then he's going to be discussing the lure of slavery to aristocracy, the twofold image of aristocracy, the lure of bourgeoisie spirit, the slavery to property and money. And then in chapter two of the section, he's going to be discussing the lure of slavery and revolution and the twofold image that those have, and the lure of slavery of collectivism, the enticement of utopia, the twofold image of socialism. And then he'll be ending the section with a chapter on the erotic lore and slavery regarding sex, personality, and freedom, and the aesthetic lore of slavery, beauty, art, and nature. And then he'll be concluding his book with part four, chapter one, the spiritual liberation of man, victory over fear and death, and chapter two, the lore and slavery of history, the three kinds of time, the twofold interpretation of the end of history, and the creative, active creative eschatology. So in section one of chapter, or in section A of chapter one of part three, he has some of my favorite writings of his that I've come across, and I've always seen or long since seen the quote that I find here talking about the twofold image of the state.
Mm.
And I'm so stoked that I like actually found the place in the book and the section where he's making this quote and seeing the quote in its entirety. And I'm just going to go ahead and excuse me, read from this section of the book is page found on page 147.
Mhm.
And he says, the religious truth of anarchism consists in this, that power over man is bound up with sin and evil, that a state of perfection is a state where there is no power of man over man, that is to say, anarchy. The kingdom of God is freedom and the absence of such power. No categories of the exercise of such power are to be transferred to it. The kingdom of God is anarchy. This is a truth of apathetic theology. The state, skipping a part of the sentence, the state and power are bound up with evil and sin. They are not transferable to any state of perfection. The emancipation of man from slavery is the attainment of absence of power of man over man. And here I'm like, as the inner anarchist in me and the inner like Christian, just like jumps with joy at this text, this quote, because to me it just like hits the nail on the head in terms of like the juxtaposition between the state as we understand it and what he would call like the objectivized world, and its difference between that and what is meant by the kingdom of God. Because some anarchists would claim that you can't be a Christian and be an anarchist because you're just transferring one's obedience and subservience to a different kingdom, i.e., the kingdom of God. But
Mhm.
for Berdyaev, he's like, no, no, like there is no power over you in God's kingdom. It's just your own creative, volitional will co-creating with God in the here and now, which breaks into like the eternal, um, and it like completely, turns the notion of subjugation or God as a ruler or a master like on its head. And God is the suffering God who sacrifices himself to reconnect himself with us, not one who lords over him over his, creation and demands certain moral obligations to be met at the penalty of eternal suffering and hellish landscape for all eternity and never-ending suffering. So for me, this just like rings like with so much joy and truth that like I'm so stoked I found it reading this book.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, that's a good point that Berdyaev's idea of God, a connection with freedom and creativity, really aligns with this suspicion of the state, especially the state of, as an idol, a sovereign entity that has supreme power, ultimate authority, complete independence. I mean, he says on 151 that the state is a necessary thing, but then he critiques necessity and determinism. He says that everything necessary, everything which is urgently indispensable in human existence belongs to the lowest values. So, it is kind of interesting how and I think we talked about this last time, these two values being in conflict, the collective and the individual. And ultimately, it seems like to me, Berdyaev always kind of lands on the priority of the individual, understanding that this, it can kind of be something that is not possible to really fulfill and actualize in sort of the current era, the 3D era. Like for some of Berdyaev's visions for us individually and collectively, we have to have, the second coming of Christ, the new earth. We have to have the world transfigured for it to really play out. So some of these things that he's critiquing are kind of like have a necessary evil to them, I think.
Yeah, certainly in the quote unquote objectivized world, right? That we find ourselves in our fallen state, according to his like theology, so to speak. And that brings up a question that I wanted to ask you. Like, you've read now two of Berdyaev's books, The Destiny of Man and this one, and I've always like kind of wrestled reading him, like coming to terms with what he means by the objectification or objectivization of the world. And I'm kind of curious to get your take on it through his reading, what he might mean by that term and what role that notion plays in his philosophy.
Yeah, that's a really good question and a good term to unpack. I mean, I think because Berdyaev values so much creativity and freedom that indicates movement and dynamism and kind of an expansion beyond finite, frozen, idolized kind of objects. He's talking about this, I think, really clearly when he talks about a falsified beauty, versus a true beauty. So he wants to get away from deterministic, kind of externalized, and internalized ideals and ideas, maybe even moralized or coerced kind of states, so that because that is in contradiction to what a human being is. And what personality is. Personality has to have room to create an experiment and freedom to not be punished for that. And so I think the objectified world is everything in contrast to what he sees as human potential, creativity, and freedom.
Yeah, yeah, I think that contrasting lens helps um, clarify the notion, which at times can be a little unclear exact because he just uses it so much. And if you're not familiar with what exactly he means by it, you can get a little confused by exactly what he's saying, but I think that, contrasting lens of being the opposite of what he sees as the heart of what it means to be a human person in relation to God, as a free creative agent does a lot of, it helps to make sense of what he means. Yeah, I guess like from my reading of him, I would, you know, surmise it as I hate to bring it back to Carl Jung and his kind of psychology, but I feel like the two thinkers are actually quite in alignment on a number of things, even though they use different terminology, as I mentioned on our last episode. But like I see Berdyaev's understanding of objectification or objectivization um, as basically like a projection that humans endeavor in to personify things in the external world, whether it be the very notion of God or the state or nature or being or society or civilization, all the different ways in which he critiques the ways in which humans make themselves slaves to these notions and these ideas, these abstractions, as he would call them. Um, it's a projecting out of human characteristics and qualities onto these externalized abstractions, and then basically humans giving up their freedom and being made of service to these idols. Basically, he sees them as ultimately as idols, as false gods, as false values that hold and maintain the apex of our human striving. That like we instead of finding those values within ourselves, we falsely ascribe them to these external things and then make ourselves slaves to them. And that for him, I think, is like the core, like whether you're talking about objectivization in terms of the state or any other form of slavery, uh, that's like the cornerstone of it is basically just a projection. And it's like so Jung, he talked about projection onto like a person, which it could also happen in terms of like the fetishized objects or whatever. Like you see a stone and like there's this archetypal significance to the stone and you kind of marvel at it and it's really like and that's what the alchemists did, right? Like they projected their own subconscious or unconscious transformative experiences onto their experiments. And the alchemy that they were doing to turn lead into gold was really a projection of turning their base egocentric selves into like the gold of like the phenomenological self or experience of that self or like the totality of their personhood or their individuality. And so but Berdyaev is not so much concerned about. I mean, he is concerned about the social aspect of it, and he says that we can be a slave to society and to culture, and those are part of his critiques. But he sees it, which I think is so fascinating, like in a much broader scope than I think Carl Jung exactly delineates. At least I haven't read all of Carl Jung, so I'm sure like his collective work on civilization. I forget the name of that collective work, something about civilization, probably, speaks something to it. But so things, even to like the effect of something like being itself, like this notion of being in a philosophical, ontological sense, the notion of culture or nature, which I think is a really wild one, like the cosmos, or projecting our human values into this non-human thing and seeing it as the pinnacle of greatness when really like or of values like the most important thing when really all those most important things are caught up in subjectivity and not in any externalized object, whether imaginary or real, which I just find so fascinating.
Yeah, that's been a real challenge on my own spiritual walk to, I think we are conditioned and influenced when we are in religious circles to externalize what is truly valuable and meaningful and, forget about our own sort of reality that is also, if we are really created in the image of God, then there's a lot to attend to. You know, all of our attention sometimes, I think, on a spiritual or religious walk is indicated and sort of projected outward. And I think that can enslave us because it can make us dependent and feel powerless and passive instead of co-creators with God. Um, yeah, and I really like that you are bringing up Jung because he talks about consciousness and he talks about Freud as well. Um, this is a quote about revelation. He says, a deep-rooted revolution is a change in the structure of consciousness. And he also says there exists a collective unconsciousness, but not a collective consciousness. That's on 203. So yeah, I see him in conversation with Jung. I see him in conversation with Sartre and also Nietzsche. Like, you know, Sartre says famously that we're condemned to be free. I think that Berdyaev talks about this, how comforting it is. Our slavery is comforting. It's comforting to think of ourselves as, locked into particular identities, even when it's those identities might be connected to neuroses or pathologies or traumas, something that's kind of negative, because there's a certainty in it, and the risk of freedom is the unknown and the sort of expansive state of possibility and play that if we truly participate in it, then there is responsibility and there is ongoing kind of activity that we sort of have to employ.
Yeah, it makes us a lot more responsible, and he does definitely draw out that observation that the majority of people don't necessarily love freedom. That slavery of some kind of one's choosing, like picking your poison, so to speak, is generally speaking what the default response to life that humans participate in, as opposed to his project, which is a reevaluation of values and finding it in the subjective, spiritual, free, living personhood in relation to God. Rather than taking the weight of that responsibility upon ourselves, we're like, oh, like I'm an American and like America first and like government rah rah rah, like or like whatever it is. And it's interesting too how it's easy for me to like poo-poo the notion of like nationalism or state subservience or I don't know, having critiques on societal expectations and guide rails and the slavery that we can get ensnared in those sectors of life. But, the radical notion of like being a slave to the cosmos or nature or even our notions of God, that strikes a little more closer to home and it makes me like have a little more food for thought and like, well, am I just trying to escape my personhood by ascribing the importance that is truly found within the relationship between myself as a free, creative, individual person in relation to God onto the cosmos and like escape that burdensome responsibility of taking accountability for my actions in the world? Or, even things like finding ecstasy in, or quote unquote, I don't know, like salvation through cultural creative pursuits such as like the arts. And I found it really kind of challenging when he talked about the lure of asceticism. and escaping the reality of the world through aesthetic values or an aesthetic way of viewing the world as this passive, non-creatively responsive, just kind of surrendering through what he kind of considers to not always even be necessarily beautiful, like you mentioned earlier, like a true beauty versus like a false beauty.
Mhm.
And I think that distinction between those two is wrapped up in the activity of the person involved. Like, are you just a passive consumer of what is considered by cultural fashion or fads to be seen as beautiful, or are you actively creating beauty in a way that is spiritually attuned, not only to creativity and freedom, but also to love, which he says at some point, like the three have to go together. Like you can't just be creatively free and I'm trying to find that. Or you can't just be there was another one. There's beauty, freedom, and love. So you just can't be free. You can't just create beautiful things. You also have to be loving. And you can't just be loving. You also have to create beautiful things and be free. He says like one without any of the other three is a snare into slavery. And an act, a whole person living in relation to God fully will embody all three, which I find just so helpful because it can get kind of seeming like, oh, as long as you're creating beautiful things, damned be to the world, you can do whatever you want. But like if that embodiment of creativity and freedom isn't also embodying like love, then like, it's kind of it's you're still missing the mark. You're still objectivization of those pursuits, and you're kind of just like enthralled in your own individual self without that compassion towards your fellow human beings. And that isn't really like part of his understanding of what it means to be a person, the fullest vision of it, anyways.
Yeah, he talks so much about the individual and personality and personalism. And I think that's all a really good reminder, kind of this generosity toward the collective and toward the social and toward the other that ultimately is a part of this foray into our individual kind of creative projects and world and encounter with beauty because I think it aligns with what I really believe beauty and the encounter with it is, and creativity and eros. It's something that I was listening to this lecture the other day on how beauty turns us to the eternal. And one of the sentiments in that lecture mentioned how beauty is not a quality. It's not something to possess. It's not something to objectivize, but or own, but it's an effect. And it's a transformative effect. And he talks about in this chapter how true beauty is a transfiguration. It's an anticipation of the transfiguration of the world. So it's kind of an expansive outward sort of encounter. And whenever we truly see beauty and we are captivated by it in sort of a situation of the sublime, we we kind of transcend our own ego and all of the sort of like objectified parts of ourselves and our preoccupations, like I feel them kind of drop away and disappear from me, when you're looking at a stunning sunset, or just you're out in nature, you're in a forest, you're in an expansive kind of field, and you're awestruck by the power and the beauty of nature. It connects you. It transcends beyond the ego, and connects you to the collective. And for me, and I think for many people, there's this impetus to want to share it, to share the beauty, the beautiful scenery, maybe with a loved one, or to want the whole world to be sensitive and aware of this kind of beauty. And it doesn't have to be nature. It could be even like a feeling that we have when we are just connected with ourselves. But I think when we're connected with our true selves, we're connected with the cosmos, we're connected to the collective, and we want to be in service to the world so that everyone kind of can encounter this ecstasy.
Yeah, I mean, it would be wrong to think that Berdyaev's emphasis on subjectivity and personhood is an accusation against communal living. You know, for him, the community doesn't exist without persons, and the persons, while they might be the focal point of the community, um, as persons, like that weight is anchored in personhood itself, in individualized, unrepeatable, unique, um, irreplicatable centers of gravity. Like he's not by any means demeaning the notion of community. He just thinks that the slavery that can arise from placing something like the collective at the center of importance in terms of the hierarchy of values is always going to be deadening to the human soul, spirit, mind, and body, and even to the society itself. And so, yeah, I think that's an important thing to highlight for sure. Um, I'm
Yeah,
trying
and
to
I
find
think that it's
quote.
also, I think it's a common sort of critique or risk when we're reading the existentialists, right? Because Nietzsche can seem, when you're reading him, kind of individualistic, talking about the free spirit that's dancing in the wasteland, and kind of going against societal mores, and deciding on one's own will to power. But I think that it's and even like Sartre and de Beauvoir, talking about how we have to act on our own projects, and we don't have a self, we're selfing. But Sartre says every time we act, we act for everyone. We create by our own stories and our own way of being, we influence others, and we create new possibilities for the collective. And I think you can even read Nietzsche in terms of kind of the greater good. If everyone could feel empowered and feel like an artist and have an aesthetic justification for life, then somehow all of our differences would unite together or harmonize together, as if in this great kind of varied symphony. So that's one of my favorite sort of things about Berdyaev, because I think his lean toward love. And he says in the chapter on sex and erotic love that really the true eros has caritas, it has agape, that true love is the union with another in God. Or he says, at its highest, love is always the true vision of the face of the loved one in God. So I feel when I'm reading, I don't necessarily get as lost as I could be in other existentialist literature like Nietzsche or Sartre, because he reiterates these themes of communion and connection.
Yeah, definitely. And as an anarchist considering myself an anarchist, it can get a little dicey, right? Like you have the socialist branch, who, anarchists who consider themselves socialists and um, want some kind of collective safety net for everyone in society, so no one's left behind, so everyone's cared for, so everyone is has an equal share in the stake of, in life. And then on the other hand, you have the individualist anarchists. You have the people who only want to really care and consider about, each individual for themselves, type of like a free-for-all, anarchists, like anarcho-capitalism type anarchists. And, the socialists are like, oh, anarcho-capitalists aren't real anarchists. And then the anarcho-capitalists, like anarcho-socialists, aren't real anarchists. And there's like this huge divide in the anarcho movement about like which one's the better, which one's true, which one's the best, or more in line with anarchist principles. And I love how Berdyaev, I think he would consider himself like kind of like a socialist, like for sure, fall more on the socialist branch. Definitely not a capitalist, like that's for sure. But he does qualify his socialism by stating that, at the same time, however, like the individual takes precedent over the society, like in the sense that like not that, an individual can like wage war against society or like, harm society in any active measures in their creative quote unquote freedom, but that society can't harm the individual in seeking to, I don't know, rectify societal woes. Like you can't, like, he says multiple times throughout the work that like a single individual person is like of more value than like the whole of the cosmos or the whole of society or the whole of the state or the whole of the nation or the notion of being itself. You know what I mean? Like he's always like hearkening. So he kind of has this like really interesting, fascinating middle point between these two polarizing extremes of like, is the social more important or is the individual more important? He's like, yes. Like, straight down the middle. He's like, absolutely, like right down just to the heart of each person. That's the most important. And you can't sacrifice society for the individual, and the individual should not sacrifice society for themselves, um, which I just love about him so much.
Right. To me, it feels like this dance between polarities and also sort of the awareness that the collective, I think in Berdyaev rhetoric can both liberate and enslave, and the individual as well, like individualistic tendencies, can both liberate and enslave. So it's trying to see where, what are the shadow aspects of both polarities and how what are the enlightened aspects of both polarities, of both sides of the polarity. How can we evolve? It's kind of like, thinking about how Jung talks about the masculine and the feminine within. They're both the masculine and the feminine, or the yin and the yang, can be developed to be more enlightened, and there's not one that you have to have both of them. And I think Berdyaev even talks about androgyny in sort of a symbolic way as well, in terms of wholeness.
Yeah, I gotta say though, he did say some rather sexist things. He wasn't completely liberated from the sexism of the, what, 19th, 20th century. What was that? I think it was in that chapter on sex and slavery and let me see if I can find it. I'm sure I can. Do you happen to recollect what I might be
Yeah, when
um
he was maybe
yeah.
talking about the differences between men and women,
Yeah.
I sort of like kind of skipped that. But
I kind of sort of
yeah, I
skipped.
I don't know what. Okay, so the Sex Eros chapter starts on 222.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's somewhere in there where, women are this and men are that.
I think I wrote down sexist as fuck. Um, LOL, not so sure. He says on 232, the realization of personality, which is expressed more in man's nature than in women's, does not denote the denial or weakening of the creative life energy of sex itself, but indicates victory over the slavery of sex and the sublimation and transformation of sex. I was just like,
Right, like
okay.
why is personality expressed more in men's nature? I don't like
Yeah, I
is it a
don't.
yang aspect? And the only reason like that would bother me is because he loves personality so much. And so
I
it's
don't
like, what does
know. I
that mean
think,
for me, dude?
for me, I was like, well, he's probably in line with Jung on this as well. I think people have commented on the sexism in Jung and Jung being like, oh, like women don't have souls or something like they are soul, like they don't have souls. Or something, like kind of, just kind of cringe, like a little, you can't escape all cringe, like even as beautiful of a thinker and revolutionary of a thinker in the 19th 20th century as these Jung and Berdyaev were, like there's something about osmosis that like infects even the most brilliant of minds and liberatory of creative thinkers. So it's just like, oh, you're still human, okay, I get it, like it's all good,
Yeah,
you're a
and then
product of your
there's
time
like
to
a
some
kind
extent.
of Nietzschean statement on 231. Woman is usually inclined to slavery and at the same time inclined to enslave.
Yeah, I thought that was like a little more par for the course. I was like, yeah, I get that. No, I'm just joking. Um,
Thanks.
I'm just totally joking. It wasn't as it was. I didn't like that statement either. But that other one, I was just like, come on, bro. No, they're both bad. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if he's trying to use man and woman here as like symbols for masculine and feminine, but doesn't exactly, call forth that more, I don't even know if it would be more generous interpretation. But yeah, that was like probably the least, that was the most distasteful thing I found, I think, in the whole book.
Well, I mean, and he does say like after that, the complete and final victory over this slavery means the attainment of androgynous wholeness. So it's possible, he's just not fleshing his kind of gendered ideas out. Um, because like I said, there is like an undeveloped version of the masculine and feminine and a developed version. And, as he says, we can never really transcend. What does he say? We can never transcend the horrors of metaphysical love in this realm. So, talking about, I don't know, maybe like the difficulties of relationships, and he talks about the difference between men and women. Oh, okay, so that's on 235. The metaphysical horror of love is not to be surmounted in this world. So, and he does have some pretty incriminating comments in the sex erotic chapter on like marriage and family, that marriage and family is, objectifying and this sentence that I thought was really curious. There cannot be any sort of love um, outside of free love. And he says that childbearing is a disintegration of personality. So I don't know. I mean, I wonder. It makes me wonder about his own experiences with marriage and kids and sex and because I always feel like I mean, he says that there's a lot of trauma connected with all of these things, with relationality and sex, and I do agree with that. And so I just wonder if, some of his kind of, I guess, pessimisms about this area of life, like how personal or biographical is that?
I would say very much so. From my understanding, he didn't have kids. I could be wrong.
Mm,
I
okay.
know he had a long love of his life, who he held dearly, but I don't know if he ever married. I don't know. I should read his biography. He has an autobiography that I have yet to fully read,
Hmm.
but I think he doesn't try to make it super personal, but he does talk on personal things, but he tries to make it more of like a metaphysical inquiry into self-knowledge through his autobiography. And but my understanding is he never had kids, and I'm not sure about the marriage part, but from what he says about marriage, I wouldn't be surprised if he never married. I know he had a love for a long time. But yeah, he says some interesting things, and I get it. Like I get the repellent objectivization of relationships and love codified in the institution of state-sanctioned marriage. Like, that makes sense to me. Like, if you want to end a loving relationship, like, go ahead and get married. Like, there's something to that. Like, and yeah, like the family itself, like the slavery to family and how it erodes individual or personal freedom and all these things. But, you could read stuff like this in Berdyaev and think that he's just like, a Luddite who doesn't really care about like other people and like children or partners and like you just do what you want. It's kind of like a free for all. But like I don't think that that's exactly what he's saying either. Again, like going back to the societal relationship between what's more important, the collective or the individual person. He's like more like love. Love is more important. Like don't let the institution of like, oh, like I'm your father, so like you have to obey me like no matter what with an iron fist. I'll like demand obedience and like crush out your spirit and your freedom and your volition, or vice versa with like a partner. I think he's more concerned with like to what extent do we actually show up in a creative, loving and free spirit in these relationships that we have with people with whom, we have children or are our children. And that's kind of like his focus is like not using societal roles of like father, son, husband, wife as these deadening to the soul archetypes, so to speak, collective societal archetypes of like disenchanting of what a relationship ought to be in the meeting of another human person in the mystery of a divine, unfolding of grace and love and all the things that make life beautiful to the detriment of such relationships. So I think that's kind of more what his kick is, but he can, come down pretty hard on such notions of family and marriage for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that those places are opportunities could have been opportunities for him to kind of discuss, well, what does he see as maybe a more spiritual or free or enlightened version of family? But you're right that he does qualify it. It's not like carte blanche where he is critiquing, like for instance, family. On 234, he says, "A tyranny has been connected with the forms of family, which is still more terrible than the tyranny connected with the forms of the state. The hierarchically organized authoritarian family tortures and mutilates personality." So I think it's kind of those adjectives that are maybe missing when he's talking about marriage and children. But here, when he talks about the family, like he's really specific on what type of family um, kind of represses personality. And I think uh, you know, any of us who have had maybe difficulties in our childhood, and particularly like authoritarian or enmeshed, sort of, or even absent parents kind of dysfunction, like we can see how as adults, when we get to adults, we have to discover ourselves, we have to create ourselves. We maybe for myself, I wish I could have discovered my path of philosophy when I was 18, but I really needed to create a safe environment for me to explore what I truly liked, because I think that for a long time in my family, I was making decisions based on how free I would be, in terms of like maybe moving out of state for school or, choosing a major that I knew that I would get accepted like in college for. So my decisions were based on safety and not necessarily just what I truly have passion for.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good qualifier for sure. And you're right. I do think I've, read a number of his books and I always am kind of wishing he would flesh out more on what he means, or giving like you said, illustrating what a spiritualized, free, creative look at what these human relationships could look like. But he kind of just um, says more about what they ought not be than what they ought
Mhm.
to be. Because I think again, he's just like figure it out. He's like it's your creative call, man. Like, he's like I'm not here to tell you what it should be. Like I'm just here to tell you like what it ought not be if you don't want it to be impairing creative freedom and love and beauty. Um, so yeah, it's kind of like it's not his place almost to tell us what it should look like. And I feel like that's what he thinks about the state too. Like going back to the first section of this part of the book, like you're right. He says like the state is like an evil necessity, but like to the extent that like we can minimize the damage done by the state, like all the better, right? Like he's not here to tell us like how to conduct a state or how to construct a state. He's just here to tell us you know, like kind of like a Henry David Thoreau, right? Like that state is best which governs least, and that the best of all is like the one that governs not at all. And like when people are ready for it, like that's the one you'll have is like no government, basically. And that's kind of like I feel like his vantage point as well. Like it'd probably be disastrous if the state were to disappear tomorrow because the quality of persons comprising the society making up the state aren't transfigured enough to operate in that level of chaotic creative freedom in a way that justifies or recognizes the sovereign, or not necessarily the sovereignty, because that was another thing that was challenging his notion and critique on sovereignty, but the significance and value of each person, like we're not there yet, right? Like we haven't ascended the mount of transfiguration where the disappearance of the state would be more beneficial than harmful. But, his whole philosophy is bent on um, advocating for individuals to take up the task of creatively getting there, right? Like that's the goal. It's not necessarily what should transpire at the present moment, absent of individuals taking up that goal and attaining that level of really for him it would be like a redemptive salvation type thing. It's not like I found it interesting. He says in these latter parts of the book, he talks about like it's not about evolution so much as it is about a transfiguration. It's not about a world historical process by which we become mature enough or developed enough to take on the task of doing away with institutions like the state or marriage or family or whatever culture. It's a matter of a divine human piercing through the veil of time into eternity, um, and then like an ongoing relationship with that dimension of human experience with the divine in so-called historical time or circular time or cosmic time, um, to be ready for the falling away of the objectivization of the world, and the entrance into like eternal life, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, it's like there's some kind of alignment and awareness that has to happen. He says, when man does that to which he is called, then only will the second coming of Christ take place. And then there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and the kingdom of freedom will come. And he sort of indicates this idea of, as above, so below, and as below, so above. He says, but actively creative events in existential time will have their effects not only in heaven, but on earth also. And existential time is the time of creativity. Um, he says that every authentic creative act of man enters into it, every real act of liberation. It is not only the other world, it is this world transfigured. And I think that that's such a great sentiment because I think sometimes when we think about our finite nature and how little time we have to do the things we want and need to do and contribute to the world and be in service of others, I think that we can, if we don't think about ourselves as eternal beings, or we don't think about ourselves as connected to other realms and dimensions, we can kind of think, well, what is this for? I'm reading, myself, I'm reading all these books, and even if maybe I don't have time to, I won't have space in my incarnation currently to write a book and have sort of this lasting kind of immortality, like Plato talks about in so many of his dialogues. What is it for? I can meditate for all of these days and months and years, but maybe if I don't reach all of my goals, what is it for? But from Berdyaev's perspective, everything that we're doing, every sort of stage that we transcend, every increase in consciousness, every, joyful moment we spend meditating on our favorite philosophical texts, like that almost like energetically gets embedded into the collective and into eternity. And so it does change it, even if our lives have a particular beginning and ending on Earth, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. No, it's good. And I think his critique on like the aesthetic point of view is just that it's just like a empty reciprocal of or of passivity, right? Like there's no creative, because like he kind of poo-poos the notion of being merely a consumer of beauty, right? A consumer of whatever, like in great philosophical works. Like all you're doing is reading books, but you have no time to create one. But like, I think it's more than just that, right? It's you're just reading them, and it's kind of like a very passive thing. Like you can be highly creative, and even in response, and he talks about this too, to a great work of art. Like you don't necessarily need to create the great work of art to be creative. Your creative response to the great work of art is a creative act in itself, in the subjectivity of your own personhood. And whether it be like a painting or a philosophical work, it's the activity of the spirit of how it's received that is creative in and of itself. So it's this really, fine, nuanced look at, creativity versus passivity. It's not that if you're not writing books or if you're not creating, beautiful music or if you're not creating poetry or so on and so forth, that's not exactly what he's poo-pooing. It's are you just like going along with cultural fads and not having any real opinion of your own? Is it not like affecting your heart, mind, and soul to the effect of like actualizing experience of like reverence and transcendence? Um, so, I think it's a little more detailed out than just whether or not you're physically creating things. It's how you're also receiving them. That's important.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's very well put. It's stepping into this state that is transforming, that is ecstatic and transcending and rapturous, just using some of the terms he uses to talk about Eros. Um, and that is what has value. It reminds me of in earlier in the book, when he talks about how the creative impulse is what is important. Once you kind of finish your project and it's out into the world, it can become like an object. But the thing that's really worth kind of looking at is and it's kind of like it almost seems like a feeling or a state of consciousness and awareness and attention and being that is very active and dynamic and generative.
Yeah. Yeah, even if it's just a matter of how something is received as opposed to producing it itself. Like we produce the experience in the receiving in our free creative personhood of works of art, whether they be literature or any other medium. And I think he sees that as like a valid response to art in general. And he says a lot about art and it's pointing to another world, another dimension that breaks through into ours to reveal the conflicts in life and the tragedies in life. And I think it's that whole person response that he's seeking to try to drive home in terms of the importance of participating in that. Um, and at the same time, he's like, yeah, and go out and make something. you know. Um, but yeah, I like this. He says on page 140, 248, liberation never provides a simple escape from reality or the rejection of reality. And I think that's something that's really important in terms of like the spiritual path that people, kind of get, wrapped up in. And I think it's super fascinating that he says, objectivization doesn't just transpire in the world of objects. Like that's how it's generally projected, but like it's also like it's an activity of the human spirit. It's an activity of the human spirit that enslaves itself by um, falsely attributing the utmost significance to not only objects, but also quote unquote like spiritual realities like things like being or God. And that to be liberated from the sinful snare of objectivization isn't just freeing yourself from the world of objects, but also freeing yourself from the disharmonious, dysregulated, and
And alienated.
false. Yeah, alienated. That's a good one. He likes that term a lot. The alienation of ourselves from ourselves and from others in these spiritual dimensions as well. Um, and it made me think of The Village. Have you ever seen that movie by M. Night Shyamalan?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's so good. It's totally worth watching. Um, without giving away too many spoilers, it's about this village that lives in the middle of nowhere, seeking to escape the perils of, society or the larger culture. But in the event of the movie, you kind of like those tragedies that they were seeking to escape, like find their way into the village. Um, through monstrous means that live in the woods, so to speak. And it's just a great um, cinematic depiction of what liberation really is. Like he's saying here, it's never providing an escape from reality or the rejection of reality. Liberation is a conflict between the various forces within reality and the overcoming of those conflicts through things like, creative freedom, beauty, and love. Um, which always have to go together for him. You can't have, if you only have a number or two of them without the other, you're still going to find yourself enslaved um, to one of, various, to one or more of the various things that can hinder our liberation. So, and then let's see. Mm, yeah, if you haven't, you got to see it. It's so good. Tell me what you think.
Okay, yeah. I think
He
I
also says on 42, 49, and this is something I love about the Gnostic that's in him. Um, well, let me just check this real quick. Yeah, he reminds me of Empedocles, is that right? The pre-Socratic who thought that the world was governed by two forces like love and conflict or
Yeah,
strife.
yeah, that's
Y-
Empedocles.
Yeah, he really strikes me here. He says, yeah, so he says spiritual liberation is conflict. Like we have this notion in sometimes in spiritual circles, right? Where like once you're spiritually attuned to the divine will, like all conflict should cease. He's like, no, like that's when divine conflict starts. He's like, he's like, no, like that's the spiritual liberation is conflict. Like, hot damn. It's just so different, right? And like I found that something I don't remember where it is. Somewhere in here he talks about, collectivism of society or some other sort. And that was one thing that always like kind of gave me the icks about reading certain spiritual books on whatever spiritual development. And it's like, yeah, like once we're spiritually attuned, like we all can sing kumbaya and like have no more conflicts, when it's really like, I don't know, it seems like a good way to become like ensnared in some kind of collectivist groupthink, like, oh, if you don't think that like we should end CO2 emissions to curb climate change, then like you're not spiritual. It's like, you sure about that? Like, I don't know about the science. Like, we could debate the science, but like, you know what I mean? Like, there's certain things about the spiritual movement where it felt very collectivist. Like, and I think he and and that's what I love about him, both have this like hard knee-jerk reaction. Like, no, like we gotta like pump the brakes and really consider like, what it means to be spiritual isn't the absence of conflict. It's like now we're actually getting to the heart of why there is conflict and creatively finding a solution to, recognize your personhood and my personhood and every personhood, and no one person or collection of persons is like more important than any individual person. Um, which I think is makes things sticky, right? Like we don't like it. It's like, oh, just do whatever it takes for the greater good. When he's just like, well, goodness is kind of overrated and beauty's more important, and the beauty of a single individual is more important than like whatever fictitious abstraction of the, supposed reality of any kind of collectivized beauty of society or what have you. Um, and then he says also at the bottom and at the top of 248, 249, I guess I'll just read the top of 249. He's talking about, he says, the world is evil not because matter is in it, but because it is not free, because it is enslaved. He says, the troubles of man's life in the material world are not due to the fact that matter is evil. They have arisen from a wrong tendency of spirit. The fundamental antithesis is not between spirit and matter, but between freedom and slavery. The spiritual victory is not only victory over the elementary dependence of man upon matter, still more difficult is the victory over deceptive illusions which precipitate man into slavery in its least recognizable forms. And I love like I would consider him a Gnostic, but not of like, the hell bent, like all matter is evil type Gnostics. And I remember telling you in, I think like a comment on YouTube a while back that like, he's, he has this strange relationship between nature and like the self, right? Because on the one hand, he thinks that like nature even the self can be an enslaver of the self, right? Like that's where all true slavery stems from, is the self misappropriating its own importance and externalizing it into other things, whether they be spiritual or material. So he's not like really against nature, but if you just kind of do like a cursory reading, like a superficial reading, you might get the impression that he's, you know, anti-nature, or he thinks nature is necessarily evil, like some of the old Gnostics used to say. But here he flat out states it in plain language that the world isn't evil because of matter, but because of our spiritual attitude towards matter in the world and externalized things, which I just find super helpful in understanding the nuanced understanding he has um, in relationship to the material world, so to speak.
Yeah, and on 248, he says spiritual liberation is accompanied by transition not to the abstract, but to the concrete. Because, like, as you were saying, we can be um, objectifying in our sort of our thoughts, like our pure thoughts, and all of the kind of ideas we have about identity or our utopias in the world. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it would be really, I would like to read more passages where he's kind of talking in a more positive way about nature and the concrete, because I think that they're there. Like that's one of his critiques about beauty and about art, which Nietzsche also shares. Like you can't use art as a way to escape reality. Like and just this idea, like, well, and you were talking about sort of the shadow aspects of spiritual communities or spiritual gurus, when we try to or believe that we can separate ourselves from like the muck of reality, like we are twofold. And if we want to avoid being in delusion, then we have to always hold that paradox, the truth of the paradox that we are um, sort of base or beast and angel, that we are holy and divine, that we can create tremendous evil, but also good. In his chapter, when he's talking about eros and love, he talks about love that ascends and love that descends. But, the love that descends is, compassion and sympathy. It's caritas. So that's why you have to embrace all of it, right? The eros and the caritas. We can't escape reality in our sort of race to the new earth or the new world. Like ascending in consciousness is rooting is rooting down as much as it is ascending. Like the Buddhist metaphor, we are the lotus in the mud. If we try to separate ourselves or unroot ourselves, then we die. Then that's, not productive at all.
Yeah, I mean, he states somewhere in the latter pages of the book that, we're inescapably, as human beings, creatures of the world, right? Of nature. He just thinks that in the same way that objectivization happens to things like the state, it can happen to the very notion of nature, and that we should reclaim our creative freedom from nature instead of seeing ourselves subservient to nature, like nature is a part of us, not us a part of nature, which is like a radical thing to think, right? It's like it can seem like putting the cart before the horse, right? Like obviously we're born into nature. Um, we are natural creatures in this unfolding of natural processes. But he says that, like, yeah, like all these things are really dependent on the subjectivity of our experience, and without that, like, nature wouldn't really exist. Like the object is dead, right? Like objectivity is people use the notions of objectivity to correspond to reality and subjectivity to correspond to subjective whimsical fantasy or illusion. But for Berdyaev, he's like, no, like reality is subjective. That's what makes him an existentialist, right? And that's just like something I love about him so much. Because the focal point of his philosophy isn't seeking to have some grandiose, objective conceptualization of the world. Rather, it is to situate human beings in a place of a hierarchy of values that recognizes that without things like consciousness and volition and perception, like what are we talking about? Like a world of it really is a world of abstractions. Like if you were to take out all subjectivity from the cosmos or from nature or from God or from being, like you're left with an empty nothingness, and maybe that's the empty nothingness that things like consciousness and volition and love are spawned from. But like he would say that those things I mean he does have a notion of the unground, right? Like the notion of non-being, but and that kind of transcends like his notion of the godhood, right? It is like the ground from which everything springs, but it's not material. Like it's not an object. It's non-object. It's before any conceptualization of the object can even come into question. And so, yeah, there's this emphasis on subjectivity, but that's not to say that subjectivity is the ultimate solution. Like we can just escape into our subjective little caves and isolate ourselves from one another. That doesn't help the situation because then we're just the slaves unto ourselves, and that's still a state of slavery. And so it's really this, like you've said, dynamic interplay between self and non-self, and self and other that he's concerned with. That, yeah, is the precedent of what he's trying to achieve.
Yeah, the subjective isn't like carte blanche perfect. Like we have to still be reflective and critical. And I mean, he says somewhere that purification is continual, which kind of sounds a bit Neoplatonic to me, but we have to constantly be, we have to constantly renew our commitment and constantly increase our radical acceptance of what is and those polarities and those opposites. Like messiness is part of the risk of participating in a creative way, in an aware way, in a conscious way in the world, right? I can get really down on myself because of all my attachment patterns and my relational kind of flaws and, not want to harm people and so not go out in the world and have relationships. But as long as we are going back and forth again in that dance of meeting with each other and then doing the inner work and then, reconnecting with each other and then doing the inner work and not allowing ourselves to get stuck in really anything, whether it's our projections or the archetypes we embody or our views of ourselves or others. We are critically thinking, rational beings that also feel deeply and have these like sensual emotions. And so trying to kind of like commit to embracing and balancing and working with all of that, it's kind of a never ending sort of project that takes a lot of courage and energy and resilience.
Most definitely. How did you take to his notion of history? And his notion of, the objectivization of history as this progressive, you know, march towards the divine realizing itself as found in um, Hegel.
That's a really good question. I have to get my groceries, so can we pause for a second?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I don't know how to pause. Ooh. Okay, yeah, that's a really great question. As I was mentioning to you just now, when we were pausing, he says that there's a tragic conflict between personality and history. So that's kind of interesting. Wonder like how history can be like objectified. He also says history is made for the average man and for the masses, and that history freedom can be turned into fate. In another place, there's this quote that I really like on 261, and he talks about clock time and our obsession and preoccupation with time. He says the fact that those who are happy do not keep a watchful eye upon the clock indicates an emergence from mathematical time, a forgetfulness of clocks and calendars. The greater part of men's life is unhappy and is therefore chained to mathematical time. Like time, he says, is a part of the objectivized world.
Well, one of the types of time, he delineates like three types of time, and one being, was it cosmic,
Hmm.
historical, and existential?
Yeah.
And our, yeah, ordinary sense of, using the term time correspond to both the secular, cosmic and historical, whereas the existential time is like that time that you're referring to now, which is like kind of like what I guess what people talk about when they talk about like entering a flow state.
Hmm. Yeah, I think so. He connects it with creativity. Yeah,
Hmm.
and I mean that's interesting to like think of it connected with Hegel, because Hegel's idea is that like he really values the progression of history, and his whole phenomenology of spirit is kind of trekking the movements of, you know, well, I guess like the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis up to this idea where there can be like a pinnacle, like an arrival of the greatness. And he puts a lot of value in the state and in collective and the collective. And he talks about the historical man, how, the individual life of most people doesn't really matter. And Nietzsche talks about this too, I think, and so does Kant, how our lives are so finite. What most of us can contribute is going to be very small, but it's not about ourselves. It's about the species and the evolving of the species and the collective. So it's really interesting to put Hegel in conversation with Berdyaev because Berdyaev is focusing on the individual.
Yeah, I mean, he sees something like Hegel's philosophy as another instance of a slavish notion to the idea that, you know, individual persons don't matter, that world history is the primary value, that even the things as grandiose as the divine itself is being realized in the historical process. And Berdyaev is time and time again, you know, hearkening to this notion that like what's really significant isn't caught up in a process in time as we understand it as cosmic time or historical time, but rather existential time is where the significance of the interruption of those notions of time are injected or um, interrupted by the eternal, by God's grace cohabiting our place in the material world to the effect of bringing something akin to heaven on earth. Like that's what he's concerned with. That's what his philosophy is trying to tease out the significance of as being the pinnacle of importance, not because it's like again this passive thing, right? Like he sees Hegel's philosophy of processing the divine life of becoming to an actualized point as a passive thing that we have no real participation of. It, for him, the end of the world is an eschatological significance on the fact that we can participate it as creative individuals, where we put to rest the enslaving power of things like um, historical time or cosmic time and enter um, the kingdom of God on earth, where time, it's not that time doesn't exist, but the mode of time changes from objectivization, where things like time are more important and history are more important, and determining of our volition and our trajectory, as opposed to what he would see as us entering into a fullness or a wholeness whereby we are creative individuals in relation to God Himself, and recognizing the humanity of each person as an image of God, and no longer, wrapped up in things like nationality or the bondage of societal notions of husband and wife or child and father, um, the limitations inherent in the cultural development that our society finds itself in, or society itself. And that for him is like a liberatory breaking through of God's kingdom here and now. And it transcends space and time.
Yeah, that's really well said. So yeah, I guess Berdyaev does have, he does have kind of a goal, like I guess Hegel does, but you're right. It's a good reminder that there is some kind of passivity that you could read into Hegel, because what is moving everyone that the historical man is participating in is this like guiding thread of reason. Like reason is what there's this kind of spirit that's moving through us collectively, kind of pushing us forward. And for Berdyaev, there's not like he's not necessarily marking out specifics of what we should do, but there's a creative artistry and the sort of, I guess, commonality in all of our creative projects and our inner work is the evolution of consciousness to kind of transcend all of the ways in this book that we sort of enslave ourselves. And for Hegel and Kant, I think they both look in the external world for progress, the technology and the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, like all of these kind of great discoveries or inventions in the world is kind of moving us toward our own human potential. But for Berdyaev, it's more, I would say, like metaphysical and spiritual, and the work is psychic almost.
Yeah, it's certainly a matter of the soul and the spirit, and the consciousness of man that he's concerned with, as opposed to anything external from those. He wants to see a transformation in those dimensions to bleed into the social or cultural or state structure or anything like that. He wants a bottom up revolution starting with each individual person and informing how we relate to each other, to inform how we organize our society, and how our culture is then formed, and therefore like the state is formed, and therefore our notion of the cosmos and nature and things like the conceptualization of being and God are formed. He wants to see an inner transformation move outwards, a
Mhm.
rippling in to the outer as opposed from the outer to the in, because he sees that as enslavement. He says on 256, to him, referring to Hegel, history was the conquering march of the spirit towards freedom, and although the category of freedom played an immense role with Hegel, and he even defined spirit as freedom, his philosophy was a consistent and radical logical determinism. Logical determinism is no less enslaving to man than naturalistic determinism. Hegel wanted to instill into man the judgment that slavery to history is freedom. And then he says a little, and then he also comments on how this influenced Marx. And he says to Hegel, subordination not only history, my apologies, to history, Hegel subordinated not only man, but God. God is the creation of history. There is such a thing as a divine becoming. At the same time, this means that it is necessary to bow before the conquerors of history, to acknowledge the rightness of everyone who triumphs. And I think this was just a guttural reaction to Berdyaev being like, fuck that. Like, no, like God is not in charge of this world. Like, in scripturally speaking, like Satan is, like God, like the devil is. Like for Berdyaev, God has no what's the word? Providence over the world. He's not guiding the world in any meaningful and dictatorial way. Rather, God is seeking humans, persons, to co-create an alternative set of values from what we find in the so-called objectivized world of values that humans set up for themselves in deifying things like the state or culture or society and all the various modalities that slavery overtakes the human spirit to liberate us from such repressive and deadening institutions or abstractions and help us to live in, you could say, more harmonious way, but Berdyaev might caution us to say like in a more conflicted way with the realities that present themselves to us in the world as we find it. Um, but in that conflict lies our task and our destiny, and what it means to be truly human.
And I see collectively, and I wonder if you see the same thing, kind of our transcendence from this, our leaving behind this idolization of progress and the objectified world, the salvation of our discoveries, and the breaking down of structures of power and profit, uh, kind of like in a way, like in our apocalyptic thinking. Like, I feel like all of these apocalyptic themes in movies and literature, and even all of the sort of crises that we see in the news right now with the revealing of the corruption in government. I just watched a bit of the hearings about like MK Ultra and like all the things that they were saying that all the things that at one point were conspiracy theories and now are news. um, I see a collective movement to valuing what Berdyaev is talking about, like that he would love to value, I mean, I wonder what Berdyaev would think about the collective movement. I think of course, maybe this is just, you know, what I was like saying earlier, my algorithm, like myself or my group of the people around me. But I think I see a movement from the outer world and idolization of the material to the inner world and to consciousness and to the reclamation of our agency and our responsibility in being more aware of the old world, the shadows of the old world, even like the old Enlightenment world.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a collective shift. I think you could chalk some of it up to, astrology if people are so inclined to understanding, the influence of this, not so much the influence, but the correspondences between the heavenly bodies and our, observed manifestations on planet Earth. Um, I know, Berdyaev, as far as I understand, he thought in the earlier years, decades of the 20th century that humanity was at the precipice of a collective shift from a world of, darkness into a world of light. And then the two world wars happened, and he kind of had to reevaluate his assertion that, humanity was on the brink of spiritual enlightenment as a collective group. And I think, considering the various forms of social awareness growing in the masses, I think he would, perhaps think again that we're on the verge of something similar. But I think he would be wise enough to understand that from the first time around that, it's not a matter of passively receiving such cosmic downloads from Centauri or whatever. We have to actively participate in the destruction of the old world by the bringing in of the new. That eschatologically speaking, like the end of the world, that is the objectivized world of the various forms of our enslavement, needs to be actively sought out by each of us in terms of responding to God's creative call to the whole of our persons in love and beauty and freedom. And not negating any one of those aspects, bringing the whole of that tripartite force into the totality of our lives and our relationships with others. And it's only by those active measures and the totality of all three of those forces that we have a chance at achieving anything remotely akin to a collective bettering of society or culture or, you know, the institutions that we possess or possess us having any improvement whatsoever. And I think that's the kind of call to action that he's calling for and throughout this work.
Yeah, and I mean, I do see an active kind of or a call to action or an awareness that we can't wait for someone to save us. I mean, I know there are those threads, that I see in the collective online and comments, hoping that aliens will save us or, that there will be a solar flash that will save us. But I also hear the thread of, no, we have to, see ourselves as worlds, unto their own and do our part in raising our own consciousness and the change we want to see in the world is in ourselves in a cliche to put it in a cliche way. um, and I guess all of the talk about Carl Jung and shadow work and meditation and I don't know, I feel really positive about the awareness that everyone is sort of coming to with their own responsibility to, you can say it in various ways, like raise your vibration or to see more clearly, to get more clarity on ourselves and our collective. And maybe, when you talk about like World War One and Two and nuclear bombs and, the Epstein files, maybe that is a part of, you know, us confronting the shadow, no longer turning our head from, what we are ultimately connected to somehow, and maybe even participating in indirect ways. Um, you know, I think that it's all a part of the movement toward what Berdyaev was like seeing and hoping for, even the darkest kind of aspects of it.
Yeah, I agree. He even says on 263, history is the failure of spirit. The kingdom of God is not realized or expressed in it, but that very failure itself has a meaning. The great testing trials of man and the experience of the seductive lures through which he lives has a meaning. Without them, the freedom of man would not have been fully tested and proved. So I think, I wouldn't say, in light of, your point, I think he would agree that the horrors that we find ourselves faced with, right? Um, whether collective or individual, they serve a purpose, kind of like the old biblical story of, Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers. He's Joseph at the end of that when his brothers are kind of groveling for forgiveness for having done him a great evil. He's like, "You meant it for evil. Man meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." You know, there like it's not that God doesn't work through the tragedies of our individual and collective lives, but we can't sit back as spectators in those lives. We can't assume that everything's going to work for the good or the beautiful or the true or for the freedom of man. We have to respond to the world and to society and to what's happening around us in a creative, freedom oriented, beatific vision of what it means to be human. And that is our task. That is the work before us. That is our daily bread. And aside from that, good luck. Because, like, I don't, for Berdyaev, I don't think he's like, yeah, man, like, just sit back, relax, eat, enjoy the popcorn, like, the alien race is coming to save us, folks, or whatever. Like, God's coming down to earth. No, like, we have to participate. If none of us participate, nothing's going to happen. It's only going to go to hell. And hell is a driving force that we have to actively combat against. And in the absence of that conflict, all is lost. And like there is no, resignation from life, And that's what true art is helping us to recognize that this is, love is a battlefield and you're involved and how you show up in the world, how you fail to show up in the world matters. So, contemplate, pray, and do something of value to yourself and society and your family and whatever. And I actually really liked how he wasn't poo-pooing patriotism, because I'm a patriot, but I'm not a statist. And going way back to the beginning of the section, he really delineates the difference between, statism or state worship and what it means to be a patriot. And that's something, it was just 4th of July yesterday, and I always find this tension between patriotism and licking the boots of American militarism or whatever. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, he says that, back to the kind of yeah, it's really interesting, this section on 263 and beyond about apocalyptic consciousness. And he says that there are two ways of understanding apocalypse, a passive way and an active. And he says that the kingdom of God is not reached by contemplation alone. Um, and I think that there is going back to talking about, reading books versus uh, writing a book, etc. I think there is a really important task that every person can be involved in. It doesn't have to be grand and architectural. It can be in the outside world. I think it can also be, each of us kind of looking very clearly at our trauma and our neuroses and working through the shadows of our own psyche and finding more spaces where we can encounter beauty with each other and in ourselves and radically accept our lives at the same time that we attend to the sort of evolving nature of them, that we can do the inner work. And that is also a way to be active.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I think that's like the first task, right? Like taking that mantle to dive inward to reclaim the projections that we've made out into society or societal relations. These these terms we have with whether it be mother, father, child, spouse, whatever, or things like the state. Like that is the first task at hand is to recollect these projections and to develop our sense of self in terms of understanding those projections. And because projection is always followed by recollection if you're doing the work, right? It's you project out your inner unknown self onto these objects or these relations, and then the task of individuation is to recollect these projections and recognize them as part of your unknown self. And so I think that is first and foremost like the immediate task. And then once having um, done that, like it is certainly an on, like he said, the process of unobjectifying, if you will, the world is an ongoing task of purification. And then it's like it's not so much like I'm really struck reading this book how he is rather against the notion of process and development. He doesn't think that that's where it's at, right? He thinks it's in instances, points like a needle in a paper of just the piercing through of eternity into time. He thinks it's about transfiguration, not about process theology or process. It's not like a task that you take up over time. I mean, it does effectively become that over the course of a lifetime, but for him, what he's really concerned about is the direct communication between God and man in time, which isn't something that unfolds in time. It is the piercing of time, of eternity into time. And but that is a continual process all the same. Like it gets subsumed, I suppose, in historical time or cosmic time. It finds its place in those things, but it's qualitatively different. And that qualitative difference is what he's concerned with in terms of breaking free from the shackles, from the various forms in which slavery binds us to forget and forgo our true task and calling. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because, I think we all can relate if we have ever been, into the self-help books and working on our spiritual path, the weight of process, how we can get enslaved to the realization of the gap between where we think we are and where we want to be. So, um, I think it's really creative and ingenious that Berdyaev says, like the existential time, that creative point and state is a point, like you were saying, and it's these transformative moments that reach so deeply into the individual and the collective psyche that we can attend to rather than and ultimately, I think enslaving and self-undermining sort of linear sequence where we're trying to have our own Hegelian reach toward our own Hegelian ultimate synthesis. He says that
Yeah.
it's really the means and not the end. We can get really enslaved by the end. And how do we know what the end is, or how do we know where we're going? It takes us out of the present moment. So, I think a lot of philosophers talk about how eternal time is present time, or being in the present moment. And I think that's a really liberating way to think about this whole conversation of like self-development and self-improvement in the spiritual path.
Yeah, I love how you related it back to Hegel and it being like a miniaturized version of Hegel's philosophy in terms of society and history as a whole. But like seeing it through the lens of our own individualized personal stories as like there's going to be a pinnacle where I reach it. It's like, no, dude, the pinnacle comes in punctuated moments of, wholeness interjecting into your life. And like the more you can sink into that in a continual and purifying manner, that's the task. It's not like you're gonna, do all the work and then you're gonna reach a developmental stage of perfection or synthesis or wholeness. Like the wholeness comes to you in moments of eternity, interspersing itself here and now. And the more you can live in that, that that's the goal. It's not the goal isn't the goal, right? The means to the goal is the goal, and the goal to the means is now. You know what I mean? If that makes any sense. But yeah, I like how you brought Hegel into that, like a microcosm of Hegel. That's good. I like that.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think we can be so make ourselves miserable in the kind of means the middle of that, like the progress, because we just see how far we are from our it's also like, our own personal utopia, or our ideal for ourselves.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so I mean, Berdyaev is really consistently, I think, focused on freedom, and he understands. I mean, his whole book is kind of in hopes of trying to be aware of like the little traps of enslavement, right? And even in something that's seemingly aspirational, there's like enslavement lurking.
Absolutely. That's one of the great takeaways from this book. It's like, oh, society's enslaving. Oh, okay, I'll retreat into myself. That's enslaving too. It's like, yeah, there's no easy answer here. There's conflict at the bottom of this problem. Once you reach the heart of the conflict, then you're doing the work. So keep keep journeying on, man. You'll get there. But no, I love that so much. It's a great way to wrap up like the I wouldn't want to say synthesis of the book, but a good summation of the book in terms of what it's really calling us towards is recognizing all the various forms of slavery, big, small, and mediocre, that can really do damage to our heart, mind, and soul, and those of others if we're not, constantly on the watch and answering the call of what God's asking of us in terms of responding to his love with creative freedom, beauty, and reciprocated love. So,
Yeah, and it should feel liberating, right? Like anytime it doesn't, like I think slavery has a feeling. We can feel it throughout our body, and that's like a signal
mm,
that you know,
Slave to the ego. Yeah.
pause. We can pause and reflect.
Slavery to ego is a good one. I should focus more on that one.
Well, I'm sure it'll come up in future books that we talk about because they all seem to connect to one another.
So far, yeah, they've all had a good thread going through them, and I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're kind of at the end of the, or past the end of the second hour. So, any last thoughts?
All I gotta say is that I love this author so much. I'm so stoked that you took him up and we did this podcast on this book. I'm super stoked to have read this book and found some of my favorite passages from this author in this book. And, I just think he's such a personally, like, I like love him as a philosopher. He means so much to me, and to share him with you has meant a whole lot. So I appreciate you for checking him out and discussing this work of his with me.
Thank you. I definitely agree, and I'm so happy that I'm teaching ethics next semester because he's absolutely going to be featured, and that is just all because of you, because you introduced me to him. So, infinite gratitude.
Likewise.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks for listening. Drop your comments below, and we will catch you next time with the next upcoming read.
Adios.
Bye.